At minus 28 degrees in the high valleys of the Central Rockies, a log cabin does something unsettling. It begins to behave like a living thing under stress. The beams twist, the joints groan. Frost gathers along every weak seam like a white hand, searching for entry. That morning, as pale light spilled across the snowfields, Thomas Avery felt the cold gripping the cabin from the outside and the inside. The neighbors had warned him. Winter's early. Get more wood stacked. Quit fussing with angles and dirt piles. But they didn't understand the truth. His cabin was failing. All night long, wind had needled through the squared corners of the settler-style walls. Even with a fire burning hot enough to redden the iron pot, the interior temperature had plunged dangerously. The mattresses were stiff. The children's breath curled upward in thin, trembling strands. Thomas had burned through nearly a quarter of his firewood, and the real winter hadn't even started. He ran his fingers along the gap where two logs had shrunk apart. Even stuffed with moss, the opening was wide enough for a candle flame to flicker if placed beside it. A cabin like this wasn't a home. It was a sieve pretending to be one. Across the valley, smoke rose from the chimneys of the other settlers, straight up, confident, like they believed their cabins were invincible. They'd built them the way builders did back in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, square, tall, right angles everywhere, the kind of shape that worked well in mild forest winters, but not in the high mountain winds of the Shoshone homelands. Thomas had learned that the hard way. The Shoshone families who lived in the valley long before him had warned about this corner of the Rockies. Winds here behaved like water. They rolled, they bent, they curled, they pressed in from every angle. A straight-sided cabin didn't push the wind aside. It caught it, the way a flat boat catches a current. But settlers don't undo what they've always known. At least most don't. Thomas stepped outside, the door jerking in his hand as another gust hit. Snow dust lifted off the ground in a thin sheet, scraping across the hard surface like sand over stone. He squinted toward the ridges. A gray bruise of storm clouds hung low, promising worse. He heard footsteps behind him. It was Jonah. Older, confident, always ready with a joke. "Your cabin looks worse every time I see it," Jonah said with a grin. "All those changes, you're making it lopsided." Thomas forced a laugh. "Just trying something different. Doesn't keep you warm," Jonah replied. "Square worked fine for our folks. Works fine here. Quit chasing Shoshone tricks." He walked off, leaving Thomas with a familiar sinking feeling. He was alone in this idea. But Jonah didn't know what Thomas had seen 2 weeks earlier. Thomas had walked with a Shoshone hunter named Tamarack, a man whose calm seemed carved from the land itself. While tracking elk sign, they came across an old winter structure, rounded earth mounded against a lattice of poles, partially collapsed but still standing after who knew how many seasons. Tamarack had rested his hand on the curved wall. "This shape," he said, "moves the wind. It doesn't fight it." Then he pointed toward the horizon. "That shape," he meant the settler cabins, "splits the wind and lets it tear the house apart." Those words had stuck with Thomas like a thorn in the mind. Back in the present, he re-entered the cabin and pushed the door shut. His wife, Anna, wrapped in a wool blanket, looked up at him. "It's colder," she said quietly. "Even with the fire." He nodded. "Logs are shrinking in the dry cold. Gaps are opening. We can't fight the wind like this." Anna hesitated. "You think Tamarack was right?" "I know he was." He stared at the walls, rigid, proud, stubborn, just like the neighbors who built them. But the mountain didn't care about pride. The valley didn't care about tradition. The wind didn't respect straight lines. If they didn't act soon, this cabin would become a coffin. He knelt by the fire where heat pulsed weakly. "I'm going to change it," he said. "All of it. The neighbors won't like it, but they don't have to live in here." Anna placed a hand on his arm. "Then we change it together." Outside, another blast of wind struck the cabin. The logs shivered. Snow sifted through the smallest gaps like powdered glass. Something had to be done. And fast. Thomas stepped out once more, scanning the horizon. The storm line was lower now, sliding down into the valley like a slow-moving beast. They had hours, maybe less, before temperatures would plunge again. He needed guidance, real guidance, not guesses from settlers who built for forests, not mountains. And as if the cold had carried the thought to him, he spotted a figure moving through the trees on the ridge path, moving steadily despite the wind. Tamarack. The Shoshone hunter approached, his cloak of hide and woven grass fluttering like a second skin. When he reached the clearing, he paused, studying the cabin's form, the way a master carpenter studies a flawed beam. "You feel the cold early?" Tamarack said. Not as a question, but as a fact. Thomas nodded. Tamarack walked around the cabin slowly, running his gloved hand along the straight walls, the sharp corners, the rigid joints. Wind finds edges, snow finds cracks, cold lives in corners. Thomas swallowed hard. "Can it be fixed?" Tamarack stopped at the north wall, the one that always took the worst of the wind, and touched the logs as though feeling the memory of storms past. "It can be rebuilt," he said. "Not with more logs, with the right shape." He pointed to the angled slope of the ridge above them. "Mountain does not stand straight. River does not run straight. A good winter house should not stand straight either." Thomas felt a spark, hope mixed with fear. How long would it take? Tamarack answered simply, "Before the next storm, if you listen." Thomas exhaled, frost clouding in the air. He hadn't expected certainty. He hadn't expected help. But he needed both more than he could admit. As the wind surged again, the cabin shuddered, the walls trembling like an animal bracing itself. And Tamarack's voice cut through the sound of the coming storm. "Before you build for winter, you must first understand the wind. What made Shoshone shelters survive storms that broke every settler cabin?" Tamarack did not speak in triumph. He spoke in syllables that belonged to the land, short, exact, as if naming the things that hurt the valley. He led Thomas and Anna across a shallow hollow where the snow lay packed and glassy, toward a ring of stout poles, half buried in old bermed earth. The remains of a winter house crouched there like a beaten animal, round, low, the outer skin a crusted braid of willow and hide. It had been built in a place the wind passed through every year, yet somehow it had endured. Tamarack pressed his hand to the curved wall, his fingers leaving a dark trail in the frost. "You see how it hugs the ground," Tamarack said. "Wind slides, it does not strike. The house gives it a path." He traced a line with a stick in the packed snow, an invisible flow map. "Where the settler houses stand tall and flat," he said, "the wind finds a corner and grows teeth. Where the winter house is rounded, the wind flows like water around a rock. Less pressure, less bite." Thomas tried to picture it. Pressure building at corners, suction behind leeward faces, the way turbulence tears at seams. Tamarack showed him with another sweep of the stick, a curved arrow over the mound, a straight arrow against a square corner. The straight arrow jutted and split. The curved arrow moved on. Patterns in the snow showed eddies where wind met a corner. "They kept fire low inside," Tamarack continued. "Smoke flows where you make a draft. You must let it find its way." He tapped the ground next to the mound. "Thermal mass. Earth holds warmth. A foot of packed earth inside and out will hold heat far longer than thin air between logs." Anna moved closer. "How much earth?" she asked, voice small. Tamarack answered with a practical steadiness. 2 to 3 feet around the base. A berm that takes wind from the foot up the wall. He pointed toward the summit ridge. "And shape the wind-facing side to a sweep. No sharp ledges. Let snow pack in the right places, not where it will pry the roof loose." Numbers lodged into the conversation like nails. 2 to 3 feet of berm. Roof poles that need to flex, not snap. Smoke chutes that must be slightly offset from the center to keep draft under pressure. It was not mysticism. It was tested geometry. He demonstrated how compacted earth held weight and warmth. He explained the hide chinking next, not as improvisation, but as a technical material. Brain-tanned hide, when slightly moist and pressed into seams, swelled as it dried in cold air and sealed gaps. Tallow mixed with hair and clay made a pliant pack that would not crack with the movement of logs. Tamarack mimed the motion. Press, pack, tamp. The material swelled, the seam tightened, the physics of hygroscopic sealing. Logs shrink in dry cold, he said. You cannot stop shrinkage, but you can make the shrinkage fill with something that grows back in damp. The valley gives you both dry and wet if you use what it offers, a wick of hide and clay. Then he took them to the ridge-facing side of the mound and pointed to the roof's curve. Poles that bend carry snow load, he said. If the rafters are rigid and too straight, they act like levers. Snow becomes weight and breaks the beam. If the roof slips and conforms, the load spreads and the poles live. Willow, young spruce, flexible ribs work better than straight timbers. A diagram in the snow showed low curve, extended eaves, pitch reduced where wind hits. Tamarack explained how lowering the roof line on the wind-facing aspect reduced exposure and allowed snow to be managed as a shield, not a scourge. He spoke of draft placement, a flue that rises slightly and then bends, using the house's thermal column to draw smoke without creating a straight conduit for wind to shove smoke and cold back into the room. He and Thomas bent over the snow diagram like apprentices and master. But the Shoshone method was not a single trick. It was a system of small decisions that added up. Berming reduced convective losses by adding thermal mass and blocking low-level gusts. Rounded faces reduced the pressure differential that pried at seams. Hide chinks adapted to shrinkage. Flexible roofs survived shifting loads. Offset draft chimneys kept smoke moving without making a straight path for the storm's breath. Anna asked about time. How long before such changes make a difference, she said. Tamarack's answer was lean. Soon. When you change shape and seal, the house stops being a target. 2 nights of good smoke and tight seams. They can hold a day you would otherwise lose. His eyes did not promise miracles. He promised small, cumulative survival. A reconstruction of a mounded winter house showed similar principles. Low, rounded, smoke rising from an angled flue. A sharp gust shook the nearby pines, an audible reminder that the storm line moved closer. It was a tension spike. Theory met an imminent test. The valley's weather clock ticked down. If this kind of frontier survival knowledge speaks to you, consider subscribing to Frontier Tales of America. Low cloud rolled closer, the valley narrowing under gray. Thomas felt the old tightness in his chest. Fear knotted with a new resolve. Tamarack's outline of principles lay before them like a map. Shape, mass, material, draft, flex. The question was no longer whether the ideas were wise. The question was whether they could be put into practice in time to matter. Tamarack looked at Thomas with an even, plain stare. Do you rebuild what you have, or build with the shape the wind demands? Thomas put his hands in his pockets and exhaled a plume of white. He thought of his children, their narrow beds, the dwindling woodpile. The choice had become urgent. The map had become a plan. If they shaped their cabin for the wind, would it hold when the storm's teeth came down? Thomas stood before the cabin, as if facing an animal he had to tame. The walls rose stiff and proud, every angle a challenge to the wind, every seam a future wound. Jonah's words still echoed from earlier that morning. You're making it crooked. But the cold inside had spoken louder, and Tamarack's diagrams in the snow had shown him the truth. To survive, the cabin had to unlearn its shape. Anna came out carrying a bundle of hide strips. Her breath drifted upward as a pale plume in the thin air. Where do we start? She asked. Thomas looked at Tamarack, who answered by walking straight to the north wall, the windward side. Here, he said. The wind comes first here. The cold lives here. So you change this first. He drew another shape in the snow. A shallow angle, a slope. Cut this wall, he said, so it leans. Not much, just enough for the wind to follow and not fight. Thomas hesitated. Cutting into a standing wall felt like rewriting the cabin's bones. But he lifted the saw, braced himself, and began. The sound of the first cut tore through the morning. Harsh, desperate, irreversible. Sawdust mixed with frost as the blade chewed through a log. Jonah appeared again along the path, arms crossed, breath puffing in short bursts. You're ruining a good cabin, he called out. A straight wall is a strong wall. Everyone knows that. Thomas didn't look up. Tamarack did. He pointed at the sawdust blowing sideways in the wind. A straight wall is strong in a forest. This is not a forest, Jonah scoffed. We've built this way for generations, and the wind has lived here for longer than that, Tamarack replied. Jonah turned away, shaking his head, but not before Thomas caught a flicker of worry in his eyes. A man, hiding fear behind stubbornness. The ridge beyond them darkened under the approach of a coming storm. Hours passed. The angled cut took shape, a subtle lean, almost imperceptible, but enough to break the wind's bite. Tamarack directed each motion with a quiet certainty. Anna packed the new joint with a mixture of hide strips soaked in tallow, the smell of the warm fat mixed with cold pine, a scent of work, of desperation, of hope. The hide will grow as it dries, Tamarack explained. It will breathe, then tighten. Your logs shrink. The hide grows. Together, they close the seam. Thomas pressed the mixture into the newly forming cracks. It clung like wet muscle. Next came the berming. Tamarack led Thomas and Anna to shovel earth into a wide mound around the cabin's base, 2 feet deep, then 3. Earth against wood, a shield of mass. The work was brutal. Shovels clanged on frozen soil. Snow mixed with dirt in heavy clumps. Each load dragged the breath from their lungs. Earth slid down against the log base, forming the first rise of a protective berm. Jonah passed again, this time slower. You're burying your own house, he said. Never seen anything like this. Looks like a grave mound. Thomas kept shoveling. Anna answered instead. Better a mound than a coffin. Jonah's face tightened. He didn't reply. By midday, the berm ringed the entire lower cabin, rising like a natural wall. Tamarack inspected it, pressing the soil in several places. Good, he said. The wind will strike the earth first. The earth does not care. Next came the roof, the part Thomas feared most. Settler roofs were rigid, proud, pitched sharply to shed snow. But this valley's snow didn't just fall. It pressed, shifting its weight, sliding, packing, melting, refreezing. A rigid beam cracked under that living pressure. Using young willow ribs Tamarack had harvested earlier, they reinforced the interior of the roof. Willow bent without breaking. It distributed weight. It flexed like a lung. The willow creaked softly as it bedded into the timber frame. Anna watched as Tamarack tied one rib into place with sinew. Will this hold a full storm? She asked. It will move with it, Tamarack said. Movement is strength in the mountains. They worked until the light dimmed. The ridge storm crawled nearer, shadows lengthening. Cold tightened around them like a slow fist. But the cabin was changing. Its outline no longer sharp and stubborn, but softened, angled, grounded. It was becoming something else entirely. Inside, they tackled the chimney next. The straight settler chimney was a problem. Winds from the valley floor pushed smoke back through it, filling the room with choking air. Tamarack outlined a correction, a slight offset, a narrowing near the base to accelerate draft, a bend a hand's width above the firebox. Smoke that rises and bends, he said, moves like an animal finding a path. Thomas and Anna rebuilt the flue stones, stacking them at an angle Tamarack demonstrated with his hands. Each stone clicked into place with cold precision. Firelight tested the new flue, smoke rising cleanly into the offset vent. For the first time all day, Thomas felt a real surge of hope. When they stepped outside again, the cabin no longer resembled the ones around it. Jonah's cabin, tall and square, stood stiffly against the wind. So did the others. But Thomas's home now hugged the earth. Its angles softened, its walls blended into a mound. From a distance, it looked less like a structure and more like something grown, a shelter shaped by the land rather than placed upon it. Snow blew across the new berm, swirling upward rather than into the log seams. Tamarack studied their work with a measuring gaze. Then he nodded once, a gesture of rare approval. Anna leaned into Thomas, exhausted. Do you think it will work? Thomas looked at the storm rolling over the ridge. I think, he said slowly, we built the only thing that might. The cold deepened. The wind changed tone, a lower hum, a warning. Night approached. The storm would strike soon. and the cabin would have to prove itself. When the first real winter blast arrived, would their strange, reshaped cabin stand, or tear apart like the rest? The storm did not arrive as a whisper. It arrived as a strike, a fist of white wind thrown down the valley. By sundown, the temperature had dropped so fast, the air felt sharp enough to cut. Snow came sideways, stinging like thrown sand. The world outside the cabin vanished behind a wall of swirling white, and the storm began its inspection of every structure in the valley. Inside the hybrid cabin, the lamps flickered. The children huddled near the firebox, wrapped in wool. Thomas felt the first deep fear settle in. This was not a trial of ideas anymore. This was the mountain's verdict. Cabins across the valley dimmed into the whiteout, chimney smoke torn sideways. The first howl of wind struck the north wall, the old, weak wall, the one that had once shuddered under mild gusts. Thomas braced for the familiar rattling. But instead, he heard something else. The wind sliding upward, sheeting over the new angled surface, the way Tamarack had described. Snow curled over the roof's edge rather than slamming into the logs. Thomas exchanged a look with Anna. "It's moving," she whispered. "Yes," he said, just like he taught. But the storm had only begun its examination. The next hour brought a violence Thomas had never imagined. Wind hammered the valley at near 60 miles an hour. Snow pelted the outer walls in waves. The roof groaned under weight, then groaned again as drifting snow shifted. Jonah's cabin, visible through rare breaks in the curtain of white, swayed as its straight walls caught the full force of the gale. Inside that home, lantern light shook wildly. Frost crawled along the beam joints, testing for weakness. Another blast struck Thomas's roof. The structure dipped a hair, flexing, not cracking. The young willow ribs creaked like living bones. The movement felt wrong to every settler instinct Thomas possessed, but Tamarack's lesson echoed in his mind. Movement is strength in the mountains. Anna held the children tighter as the cabin groaned. "Is it supposed to do that?" she whispered. "Yes," Thomas said, voice low. "It's bending so it won't break." But doubt gnawed. What if the willow ribs weren't enough? What if the storm tested the structure with more than it could handle? Wind shifting pitch, a deep moaning through the angled chimney. Suddenly, smoke rolled back into Jonah's cabin across the valley. Thomas saw it in a flash of wind-borne clarity. The neighbor venting his flue, coughing, stumbling. Smoke shot sideways from his chimney, driven back down by pressure. Thomas remembered that nightmare. The coughing, the burning eyes, the panic. He whispered, "They're in trouble." But there was nothing he could do. The storm made rescue impossible. The families were islands inside a crushing white ocean. Inside the hybrid cabin, the new offset flue held steady. Smoke rose cleanly, pulled by the heat column, and protected by the angled bend Tamarack had taught them to build. The fireplace glowed steady, amber and warm, while outside the wind snapped like a whip. The children began to breathe easier, yet the storm escalated again. Snow hitting the roof so hard it rebounds upward, the valley sinking deeper in white. Snow weight built on the roof until Thomas feared the beams would implode. The wind gusted in violent bursts. Even with the new shape, the cabin felt the blows. It shuddered but held. Then came a sound Thomas had dreaded. A crack. He froze. Anna froze. The children went silent. Thomas pressed his ear to the wall. Another crack sounded, sharp, brittle, but it wasn't their roof. It was Jonah's. Through another gap in the storm, Thomas saw a dark form on Jonah's cabin, part of the roof sagging dangerously. Jonah stumbled out onto the stoop, hat torn from his head, lantern nearly blown from his hand. He tried to push snow from his shingles but slipped, collapsing against the siding. The storm swallowed him again. Thomas clenched his fists. Fear and helplessness surged through him. Anna whispered, "He'll freeze if he stays out there." Thomas answered, "He's trying to save his roof." But the truth was plain. Jonah's structure fought the storm and lost. By contrast, the hybrid cabin had formed a perfect drift along its angled face. Snow clung to the roof like an insulating blanket. The berm held firm, stopping drafts at the base. The hide chinking had swelled with moisture, sealing every hairline crack. Tamarac's system, strange, humble, softly spoken, was becoming undeniable. Snow drifting smoothly up the angled wall, wind slipping across like water. Another gust hit. The cabin flexed again, wood fibers singing under pressure. Thomas felt the movement through the floorboards, alive, responsive. It wasn't a rigid structure fighting the storm. It was a shelter shaped to let the storm pass. But then, a new threat. A high-pitched whine through the chimney gap. Anna flinched. The draft! Thomas grabbed a cloth, ready to choke airflow if needed. The smoke column wavered. For one terrifying second, the wind shoved hard enough to test Tamarac's offset. Smoke quivered at the mouth of the flue. And then, the bend caught it. The column steadied again. The chimney breathed. Thomas exhaled in relief. It held. The hours dragged on. The storm raged with a fury that felt personal, but the cabin endured each test. Angled walls, flexible ribs swelling hide seams, earth-bermed offset chimney. Each worked exactly as Tamarack had said. By midnight, the worst had passed. The wind weakened. The pressure dropped. The blizzard softened from roar to whisper. Anna collapsed onto a bench, exhausted. The children slept near the fire. Thomas sat with his back to the angled wall, feeling its real warmth, holding against the night. Outside, the storm left its scars across the valley. Inside, the hybrid cabin felt alive, safe, proven. But when dawn revealed the valley, what would the storm have taken, and what had it left standing? Dawn arrived slowly, reluctantly, like the valley was afraid to show what the night had done. The storm clouds thinned to long gray sheets. Light crept over the ridgeline, a cold blue-tinted glow that revealed the scars carved across the land. Snowdrifts rose like frozen waves. Timber branches lay broken and half-buried. A silence settled that didn't feel peaceful. It felt stunned. Thomas pushed open the cabin door. It took force. Snow had drifted high against the angled outer berm. But when the door finally gave way, a warm breath of interior air followed him out into the bitter morning. The valley was half buried in snow, smoke rising weakly from only a few chimneys. Jonah's cabin sagged. One corner of the roof had collapsed inward, boards snapped, shingles scattered like torn leaves. Smoke limped from his chimney, thin and gray. The cold had gotten in. Other cabins fared little better. Straight walls had acted like sails, catching the full violence of the storm. Some roofs were partially caved. Some seams were peeled open. Some chimneys had blown out entirely. Little puffs of frost leaked from the gaps. Thomas felt his stomach sink. He whispered, "It took almost all of them." Anna stepped beside him. Children wrapped in blankets just behind. Their breaths drifted upward in white, hopeful strands, because their cabin, the strange rounded thing everyone mocked, stood unbowed. Snow lay thick upon its roof, but evenly, like a blanket tucked tight. The angled wall was crusted with drift, yet unbroken. The berm held strong. Frost melting slowly at the base of the angled wall where interior warmth radiates outward. Thomas ran his hand along the wall. It was warm, not hot, just warm enough to prove the structure had held heat all night. His throat tightened. Anna placed a hand over his. "It worked," she whispered. He nodded. Tamarack was right about everything. A crack echoed through the valley. Hoarse, desperate. Jonah. Thomas sprinted across the snow. He found Jonah near the collapsed side of his house, trying to dig out a trapped section of the roof with numb, shaking hands. His lantern lay half buried nearby. His hat was gone. "Jonah!" Thomas called. Jonah turned, face pale with cold, eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. He tried to speak, but coughed instead. A deep, scraping cough that came from a night breathing backdrafted soot. Thomas grabbed him under the shoulders and steadied him. "You stayed in there all night?" "I had to. Roof was giving way. Smoke wouldn't clear. The storm," he coughed again. "I think it's broken through the west corner." Thomas looked toward the cabin. He could see the fracture lines. Straight walls, split at the joinery, gaps wide enough for daylight and wind to pass freely. Jonah had done everything the old way, and the old way had failed him. Thomas helped Jonah stand, wind drifting loose snow around them. Back at the hybrid cabin, Anna had opened the door fully, letting warm air spill into the morning. Jonah stepped inside, and the moment he crossed the threshold, he stopped. His shoulders dropped. He closed his eyes. His shaking eased. Warmth enveloped him. A soft heat, even. Steady. Nothing like the frantic fire he'd been feeding all night just to keep from freezing. The walls, he muttered. No drafts, none at all. He moved closer to the angled wall, touching the seam where hide chinking had swollen tight. How is this possible? Thomas didn't answer. He simply looked at Tamarack, who stood at the far side of the room, silent as ever, watching Jonah with no trace of pride or victory, only concern. Tamarack finally spoke. The wind follows the shape you give it, he said. Yours stood against it. The storm pushed. It broke. This one moved. Jonah stared at the roof. It moves? It lives with the storm, Tamarack said. Not against it. Jonah sank onto a bench near the fire. He held out his hands as if rediscovering sensation. Thomas, I mocked you. I mocked all this. If you hadn't changed your cabin. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Snow gently shedding off the flexible roof outside, drifting down in a harmless arc. Other neighbors began to arrive, drawn by the sight of smoke rising strong and straight from Thomas's chimney. They entered with the same stunned expressions Jonah wore, faces reddened by windburn, eyes narrowed from long nights of smoke inhalation. They walked the perimeter of the cabin, touching the berm, examining the slope, squinting at the hide chinking. One whispered, "Feels warmer here, even outside." Another said, "My roof's cracked, lost half the shingles." Another, "My fire nearly died." Inside the hybrid cabin, the children poured warm water for visitors. Anna handed out blankets. The room filled with quiet, shaken people, all alive because they had made it through the night, though some by margins thin as pine needles. Tamarack moved among them without ceremony, checking fingers for frostbite, offering quiet words, nodding when someone asked about a technique or material. He didn't boast. He didn't scold. He simply answered questions with the same calm he had shown during the storm. Thomas watched him, admiration rising in his chest, like warmth from the fire. "What do we do next?" Thomas asked. Tamarack looked at the battered cabins outside, then at the families inside Thomas's home. "They will want to rebuild," he said. "Not as before, as the wind teaches." A hush fell. This cabin, mocked, doubted, reshape after reshape, had become the valley's lifeline. Anna looked at Thomas with a tremor of emotion in her voice. "People will look at our home differently now," Thomas nodded. "Because now they see it's not strange." He paused. "It's alive." The storm had broken the valley and revealed the only structure shaped to survive it. Would the neighbors embrace the Shoshone methods or cling to the old ways even now? The storm left the valley quiet, but not still. By midday, a slow thaw crept in. Sunlight broke through the cloud cover in long amber shafts, warming the snow just enough to soften its hard surface. The valley smelled of wet pine, cold earth, and smoke, remnants of a night that had tested every home and every family. Most cabins looked wounded. Some had roofs split open like cracked shells. Others leaned slightly where the wind had shoved harder than the structure could resist. But at the center of the valley stood the hybrid cabin, its rounded form catching the light, its berm shedding meltwater in smooth runnels, its chimney still breathing clean, steady smoke. Families emerged from damaged cabins, staring toward Thomas's home with a mixture of disbelief and humility. Thomas stepped outside to help Jonah reinforce the collapsed corner of his house. The snow around Jonah's cabin was littered with broken shingles and shattered rafters. Jonah's wife knelt near the hearth, pulling out charred wood from where the smoke had backdrafted that night. Jonah's voice cracked as he spoke. "I should have listened," he said. "I knew the storm was bad, but I didn't think." He gestured helplessly at the broken structure around them. Thomas answered gently. Nobody thinks it'll happen until it does. That's why Tamarack showed us. Jonah nodded, swallowing a knot of pride and fear. I want to rebuild, he said. But I want to rebuild your way, his way. Those words carried deeper weight than Jonah realized. Because they weren't just asking for techniques. They were asking for humility. Tamarack ran his hand along the fractured roof beam, examining the break. Tamarack joined them without a word. He studied the damaged ridgepole, then traced the line where pressure had split the grain. This beam fought the wind, he said. It needed to bend. It could not. Jonah asked, Can it be saved? Tamarack shook his head. Replace and shape the new one. Curve the roof, lower the pitch where the wind comes. Let snow stay where it protects. Remove where it presses too hard. He spoke with the same calm patience he had offered Thomas days earlier. There was no triumph in his voice, no pride, only the quiet logic of someone who wanted others to live through the next storm. Word spread quickly. Within an hour, neighbors from the far end of the valley approached, some with tools, others with questions, others simply wanting to know how Thomas's home had survived when theirs had nearly failed them. One man, shoulders slumped under exhaustion, asked, How did you know to do this? Thomas answered honestly, We didn't. We listened to someone who did. The group turned toward Tamarack. He did not stand taller under the attention. He didn't boast or claim credit. He simply pointed to the land, the curves of the hills, the sweep of the valley wind, the way snow stacked naturally against rock outcrops. Mountain teaches, he said. We only follow. Soft dripping as snow slides off the hybrid roof, landing in rhythmic thumps. The work began immediately. Families brought shovels, axes, clay pots, strips of hide, coils of willow. Tamarack demonstrated each step with deliberate, confident movements. Wind-facing walls, angled into shallow slopes, 2 to 3 foot earth berms packed tight around lower walls. Hide chinking pressed deeply into shrinking log seams. Roof ribs of willow or young spruce added for flexibility. Offset chimney vents shaped to resist backdraft. Lowered eaves designed to catch and hold insulating drifts. Every adjustment had purpose. Every material came from the valley itself. Communal labor, settlers and Shoshone working side by side, reshaping cabins under the warming sun. Children brought buckets of warm clay from the creekside. Women soaked hides in heated water and tallow. Men climbed ladders stabilized by others. Tamarack moved from cabin to cabin, explaining the same principles as if carving them into the valley's memory. Anna pressed more hide chinking into a neighbor's seam, smiling as the material swelled. This feels alive, the neighbor said, surprised. Like the house is breathing with us? Tamarack nodded. Houses should live, otherwise they die in storms. Through the afternoon, the valley transformed. Homes once rigid and proud became grounded, rounded, softened, more like the land around them. It was not imitation of Shoshone structures. It was a hybrid, settler timber strength, blended with indigenous aerodynamic wisdom. A child helping Tamarack place a willow rib, new generations already learning. As the sun sank, the warmth dimmed. Families gathered outside Thomas's cabin, sharing food salvaged from storm-tossed stores. A sense of community, real community, rippled through the group. Something sharper than gratitude and older than pride. It was survival, shared survival. Thomas looked across the valley, now dotted with reshaped cabins, each one a testament to the night they refused to forget. He saw Jonah speaking with Tamarack, gesturing at the roof angles with genuine curiosity. He saw families warming their hands near new vents. He saw children running between berms and snow-packed walls. Anna stepped beside him. Look, she whispered. They're all changing. Thomas nodded. And it started because one person showed us a different way. Anna smiled, wiping a strand of hair from her face. Different saved us. The valley that had once mocked the misshapen cabin had become a workshop of indigenous informed survival techniques. Every home, a new blend of cultures and knowledge, shaped not by pride, but by wind, snow, and necessity. A neighbor approached Tamarack with quiet respect. Your people, then? They knew this long before we came, he said. We should have asked earlier, Tamarack replied with the faintest smile. You ask now, that is enough. But what symbol would remain after this winter? What reminder of the night the valley's future changed? By the final weeks of winter, the valley felt transformed. Not because the storms had ended, but because the people had learned how to stand with them instead of against them. The snow no longer looked like an enemy. The wind no longer sounded like a threat. The hybrid cabins, soft-walled, earth-bermed, wind-shaped, rose from the valley like natural growths, as if the land itself had taught the settlers how to build. Light returned earlier now, golden, gentle. Long shadows stretched across the hard-packed snow in elegant curves that mirrored the new rounded walls of the homes. Smoke from dozens of offset chimneys rose in graceful columns before drifting toward the ridgeline, evidence that every house in the valley had learned a new way to breathe. A valley full of hybrid cabins glowing in the afternoon sun. Thomas stood outside his home watching the light change. The angled wall, once mocked, caught the sun like a warm stone. Meltwater trickled from the roof and followed the smooth line of the berm. It all felt quiet, content, as though the house were at peace. Anna stepped out beside him, pulling her shawl tighter. It's strange, she said softly. I used to fear winter. Now I feel like we understand it. Thomas nodded. We survived because we listened, because Tamarack showed us what the mountain expects. At that moment, Tamarack approached from the ridge path, his steps calm, measured, leaving footprints that barely pressed into the snow. His expression carried something deeper than pride or relief, something Thomas hadn't seen before. Farewell. Thomas's stomach tightened. You're leaving, he said. Tamarack nodded once. My people move to warmer hunting grounds as the season turns. We return when the roots rise. Anna swallowed hard. We won't forget what you taught us. Tamarack looked around the valley. Families repairing, reshaping, laughing, sharing food, reinforcing roof ribs, shaping new chimneys. The settlers stood not as separate households, but as a single woven community touched by shared hardship. It was not teaching, he said. You watched the land. I only pointed. Tamarack removed a willow rib from the bundle on his back. He held out the willow rib to Thomas, a single piece of flexible pale wood, light as breath, stronger than a straight beam when winter pressed upon it. Thomas took it reverently. What does it mean? He asked. Tamarack answered with quiet certainty. A house that bends survives. A people who bend learn. Keep this so the valley remembers the winter it listened. Thomas felt the weight of the rib. Not physical, but symbolic. This was the memory of the storm, the lesson, the turning point. Behind them, Jonah and several neighbors approached, stopping when they saw Tamarack preparing to depart. Jonah removed his hat, humble and sincere. We'll keep building this way, Jonah said. We'll teach our children and their children. Tamarack inclined his head. That is all winter asks. The valley glowing under a soft winter sunset, hybrid roofs curving like gentle waves. The evening light deepened. The snow caught fire with orange and gold. Every roof, every berm, every angled wall shone with the proof that survival is not brute strength. It is wisdom shared across cultures. It is the courage to admit old methods failed. It is the humility to learn. Thomas looked at the willow rib in his hand and felt the truth of the season settle inside him. This winter had not merely tested them, it had changed them. His voice carried low, almost to himself. We'll remember. He turned toward the camera inside the story itself, a quiet, reflective moment in the fading light. If this kind of frontier survival knowledge speaks to you, consider subscribing to Frontier Tales of America. As Tamarack walked toward the ridge path, the valley fell into a peaceful hush. Hybrid cabins breathed warm air into the sky. Children's laughter echoed between the berms. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, not just because they lived in the same place, but because they survived the same night. The winter that almost broke the valley had become the winter that taught it how to live. And the willow rib, held in Thomas's hand, became the symbol of everything that endured, everything that changed, and everything the wind had whispered into the valley's future. What other forgotten indigenous knowledge waits in these mountains, ready to save those willing to listen.